Hello, everyone. This presentation is the outcome of the research conducted in Central Africa in the framework of the Asia-Africa Democracy Forum on CSO engagement with SDGs in Asia and Africa. The work was conducted by myself, Martin Sunker, the leading consultant of the Bureau for Economic and Technical Studies in Cameroon, assisted by Adelaide Emaga, Florent Jokwa Bianjeu, and Thomas Roger Owun. Our presentation will be based on 4 pillars: the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs in Central Africa, the COVID-19 in Central Africa, democracy and civic space, and CSO international engagement on the SDGs. In the Sustainable Development Goals in Central Africa, we are going to cover the overall implementation, SDG 5, 10, and 16, and the link to human rights. For the COVID-19, we're going to look at the impact of COVID-19 on democracy and human rights. For democracy and civic space, we are going to look at democracy, civic space, and press freedom. And in the end, we're going to look at engagement spaces that international organizations offer the civil society in Central Africa. The countries that we are covering are the countries of the CEMEC zone, the 6 countries of the CEMEC zone, plus DRC and Sao Tome and Principe. Let's start with the level of SDGs achievement in the sub-region. We can see on the table that as of 2021, the overall achievement of the SDGs is very low in the sub-region. Only SDG 13 is the one where all the countries considered are on track of maintaining achievement. Whereas we have only Central Africa, the Central African Republic, on track for SDGs, for SDG 8, and Gabon for SDG 7. For the rest of the SDGs, the countries are mostly stagnant. In all the cases, we can see that countries face a lot of challenges. As you see in red, this is the level of challenge that countries face in their SDG achievement. Only for SDG 14 that you see less red when you go through the table. The top 5 for the sub-region in terms of SDG achievement are goals 15, 8, 13, 7, and 12. Now, this is the evolution since 2016. From 2016 to 2021, SDGs performance in Central Africa has not improved much. All the countries have almost stagnated in their rank, and whenever there has been an improvement, it was insignificant. Actually, the least performing countries in the world in terms of SDG achievement are in Central Africa. Central African Republic, for instance, is the least performing country in the world. Now, what is the situation of VNR in these countries? These countries have presented their VNR as from 2018. Only Gabon and Sao Tome and Principe have not gone through the exercise, and Chad is the only country which has gone twice. However, Gabon will be going for VNR in 2022, when Cameroon will present for the second time. What comes out of the reports reviewed for Central Africa on VNRs show that Chad that the priorities for Central Africa are mainly about strengthening the SDG implementation and evaluation frameworks, plus looking at ways to mobilize sufficient financial resources. The main challenge in almost all the countries relate to peace and security. As for the SDG localization process, all the countries in general considered the 17 goals, except for Central African Republic, where only 6 goals were prioritized. In terms of targets, countries prioritized from 37 to 169 targets. A review of the national SDG localization documents indicate that the number of targets prioritized by Central African countries vary, as I said, between 37 and 169. The approach of this localization process was participative, with workshops and specific events to help the people take ownership of the 2030 agenda. The aim was to be able to reflect the concerns and expectations of all groups of population in national priorities. Now, what about the legislation? You have countries like Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Sao Tome and Principe, which adopted specific regulations on SDGs implementation. Whereas countries like Cameroon and Chad or Gabon have rather put the function of SDG follow-up under existing ministries, with some of the times interministerial committees being in charge. The main challenge, as we said, about SDGs implementation remains the full enforcement of existing instruments, insufficient internal and external financial resource mobilization, and the secular frivolousness of institutions in the sub-region. In addition to this, you may add externalities such as the COVID-19. Now, what is the state of national institutions and strategies for the SDGs in these countries? As we said earlier, there are countries that have specific institutions. It's the case of Congo. And others have the function under specific ministries like Cameroon, Chad, and Sao Tome and Principe. But what we can say in general is that the main thing missing in this landscape, institutional landscape, is communication strategy on SDGs. For multi-stakeholder partnership, this is a fact in the region, because the localization process for the SDGs was based on convening all levels of people, including local government, civil society, private sector, to work with the central government on the localization and implementation process. But still, a formal space is not yet really allocated to the civil society. And we note that UN agencies and INGOs have supported processes in all these countries. What about the national mechanism on the SDGs in terms of data collection? Data collection is a serious issue in this sub-region, which is even the case, as we know, for many African countries. So countries here have taken action to improve on their national statistical system, because NSOs, National Statistic Officers, are generally in charge of collecting data and informing on SDGs for progress. But even though technical and financial partners help complement these statistics with more specific information through programs and projects, there is still need for capacity building in these countries and for financial resources to really make the statistical system effective. What is the situation on SDG 5, 10, and 16? For SDG 5, as you can see on this table, the situation is such that countries have been facing maximum challenge in implementing the SDGs. That's what is given on the dashboard in red. So all the countries are marked in red, because even though the level of achievement may be around 50% for a country like Cameroon, or for a country like Gabon, which is 62.8%, still these countries face real challenges in achieving gender equality. This is almost the same for reducing inequalities with SDG 10. When you look at the table, you see that the red is still there, except for Equatorial Guinea and Gabon. But the majority of the countries really face challenges in implementing this goal. As for SDG 16, same again, except for Sao Tome and Principe, which is one of the most stable countries in the sub-region. Now, what is the link to human rights and universal peer review? This is what an analysis of the recommendations with regard to UPR2 and UPR3 give. You see on this table that most of the countries in the sub-region have accepted more than 70% of the recommendations that they received, be it for UPR2 or for UPR3. When you go country by country, you can see, as in the case of Cameroon here, that out of 171 recommendations that were presented, 121 was accepted. And this is for UPR2. For UPR3, you have 196 recommendations, out of which 133 were accepted. This represents a kind of progress, like 10% progress from the situation at UPR2 to the situation at UPR3. And that level of progress, you can see that Central African Republic, for instance, has 1%, Chad 64%, Congo 15%, DRC 15%, Equatorial Guinea 32%, Gabon 36%, and Sao Tome and Principe 2.75%. And when you look at all these countries, you see that recommendations generally were made on institutional framework, on political and political and human rights, and also on economic and social rights. Now the link between UPR and the SDGs top 5, what you see on this table is that SDG 16 is the goal on which the most recommendations were made, which informs on the fact that this sub-region is really in a situation where the main challenge is about peace and security. Now, the analysis of the recommendations made to SDG on SDG 5 and 10, when you look at all the countries, this is what you can see. You see that DRC, for instance, leads in terms of accepted recommendations, while Cameroon and Sao Tome and Principe have the most of recommendations that relate to SDG 10. What I was saying is that DRC has the most on SDG 5, while Cameroon and Sao Tome and Principe have the most on SDG 10. Most of the recommendations here, as you can see on this table, generally the only noted recommendations relate to constitutional and legislative framework. This may inform on the fact that governments in these countries are somehow reluctant to bring changes to their institutional framework. The state of progress of SDG 5 and 10 would link to UPR. When you look at these SDGs, you can see that Cameroon and Gabon had both SDG 5 and 10 among their top 5, and other countries had only SDG 5. These are some remarks that could be made here. When you take the two cases, Cameroon and Gabon, you see that Cameroon has accounted for 55% achievement for SDG 5 and 23% for SDG 10, while Gabon accounted for almost the same level to the two SDGs, that is 47 on gender equality and 50 for inequality reduction. This suggests that by ensuring gender equality, Gabon has reduced inequalities, while despite the achievement of gender equality, Cameroon still has issues with the reduction of inequality. What does this mean? A possible explanation is that the kind of inequalities challenge that face Cameroon is less related to gender and rather due to other factors. The UPR recommendation percentage for SDG 5 and 10 are 26 and 9% respectively for Cameroon, and 30% and 7% for Gabon. Cameroon, at the same time, ratified 9 out of 9 treaties, whereas Gabon ratified only 9. What does this mean? This probably means that ratification is not necessarily followed by enforcement of the legal instruments that are adopted in Central Africa. The COVID-19. What has been the impact of COVID-19 in these countries? First of all, what is the situation? Here is the situation in Central African countries. You can see that countries that marked green are Chad and DRC, This is where you got the least death per million. Then as you go up, you get Congo, then Gabon and Cameroon, and then Equatorial Guinea, then Sao Tome and Principe. There is no country in the highest zone of assessment. Now, what is the impact on democracy? This is what the Worldometer gives. And among the countries that are assessed, you have Central African Republic and Congo, who had elections during the period after the pandemic. For these countries, the situation is such that Central African Republic, in terms of voter turnout, stepped from 59% to 79%, which is a progress despite the pandemic. And Congo stayed stable at 61%. Democracy and civic space. This is what we got for democracy. You see from the colors that many countries in the sub-region are in the situation of authoritarian regimes. What about a civic space? On this chart, the colors show where you have some kind of free space. Red means that on these criteria, there's nothing good. So, in short, only freedom of association and freedom of media freedom is a reality in this sub-region. All the other criteria are not good. Now, let's go to the CSO engagement on the SDGs in the sub-region. These are the multi-stakeholder forum that we have on the SDGs in Central Africa. You have the forum des organisations de la société civile d'Afrique centrale, FOROSCAC, which is a free space where civil society organizations work around the acres to get the voices of the people heard and to influence decisions from leaders. Then you have the civil society platform on the, development effectiveness, CPDE, which originally was focused on development effectiveness, and after the SDGs were adopted, brought the SDGs as part of their agenda. And the third one is the Common Working and Collaboration Platform, CWCP Central Africa, which is an open space, a multi-stakeholder open space, which was originally initiated by the civil society and which brings together all stakeholders through specific platforms between governments and non-state actors. What are the regional forums where African CSOs in the sub-region can engage? The main one is the African Regional Forum on Sustainable Development. Actually, this is something which has to do with major groups. And this is where the mechanism, the African Regional mechanism on the major groups and other stakeholders is operated within the AMGOS. The role is to facilitate participation of major groups and other stakeholders from Africa to be part of global spaces. Central African CSOs are part of this process, and they can engage there. Here you see international and regional organizations where African CSOs can engage. At regional, in terms of regional organization, you have ECA, the NEPAD, and as I said before, the African Regional Forum on Sustainable Development, AFDB, and AGAT. At sub-regional level, you have the CEMAC, which is the Economic and Monetary Community for Central African States. Then you have the ECAS, the Economic Community of Central African States. And you have the regional office of ECA. And then you have specific institutions that deal with nature protection, particularly forest protection. You have the COMIFAC, which is the Central Africa Forest Commission, and the CEFDAC, which is the Conference on Dense and Moist Forest Ecosystems of in Central Africa. Now, what can we say in conclusion? The priorities for Central African countries are, in terms of SDGs engagement, implementation, and evaluation are concerned, strengthening the SDG implementation and evaluation framework, mobilize sufficient financial resources, whereas the main challenge is almost the same in all countries. It has to do with peace and security. So in general, specific national communication strategies are missing on SDGs. And despite the fact that SDG 16 shows little progress in Central African countries, the link between that goal and universal peer review is more significant in terms of noted recommendations. This is understandable because many of the countries in the sub-region are either in situation of war or in situation of social unrest due to post-electoral situations. Another thing that can be said here is that the kind of inequality challenge that face some countries in Central Africa is less related to gender and rather due to other factors and such as ratification of human rights, other factors, and that ratification of human rights related to enforce related treaties is not necessarily followed by enforcement. So the enforcement of treaties that that were ratified by these countries is not always a reality. So Central African countries tend to be failing to enforce the very legal instruments that they ratify. This is quite an issue of concern. Now, the last thing that can be said here is the COVID-19, which has revealed the level of unpreparedness against externalities and uncontrolled situation in Central Africa. Planning for such in terms of risk management should be part of the SDGs implementation process. Thank you all.